Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Chapter 4 of our series, How to Win at Online Poker. In this chapter, we're going to talk about the different type of poker players at the tables and how to adjust to them properly. There are several different types of poker players out there, each with their own strategy. Each player is going to have their own weaknesses and strengths, and identifying and exploiting these weaknesses will give you an edge over them. It's important to realize that each style plays differently, and a strategy that works against a weak passive player, for example, won't work against a wild and aggressive one. This is why it's so important to learn to adapt to them. While there are many different styles of play, players will basically fall into one of the following four categories. Tight passive players actually play a solid range of hands and often know what hands to play and when to play them. Because of this, they play pretty good before the flop. If they show aggression pre-flop, it's usually a good sign that they have a pretty good starting hand, and if they just call, you can assume that they have a weaker draw type hand or smaller pair. Where tight passive players fail to play good is post-flop. Since they're so passive, they will often check call instead of raising, which gives players on draws the correct odds to try and hit their draw. Tight passive players play very transparently, which makes them pretty easy to read. If they show aggression post-flop, it usually means they have a fairly strong hand. You won't often see these type of players trying to bluff. Adjusting to a tight passive player is actually pretty easy. Just loosen up your range against them a bit and steal their blinds relentlessly. Since they play so tight, it's profitable to steal against them a lot more. Post-flop, you want to pay attention to the texture of the board and bet against them when you think you're ahead or they are on a draw. These are the kind of player you can bluff against, as they will be more willing to let go of a hand when they don't hit. If the board is particularly scary or connects a draw, do be ready to let go if they change gears and suddenly become aggressive. The key to remember is that they don't bluff very much. A tight aggressive strategy is often the optimal line of play. Virtually every poker site has an article on the importance of playing a tag strategy, and with good reason. Playing proper, tight, aggressive poker is the best way to ensure that you'll win in the long term, while minimizing your losses in the short term. Now, you're not often going to be up against a player that plays a proper, tight, aggressive style, so it's really important to pay attention to what they're playing and just how they play it. A good tight aggressive player has a solid starting range of hands and plays their hands properly according to position. They will often opt to bet or raise instead of just checking or calling, but does so in the proper situations. They will protect their hands by making opponents pay for draws and raising when they sense weakness or for value when they've got a made hand. As a rule of thumb, it's a good idea to stay away from a good tag player, as you'll either end up winning a little pot against them or losing a big one. A solid tight aggressive player can be hard to adjust against, but there are a few things you can do. First, you want to tighten up your range a bit, but don't be afraid to bluff if a board is favorable. These are the kind of players that you can float against, as they will often fold if they think you've hit a draw, even if you haven't. It is important to pay attention to the board, as they will often play a strong range of hands, so it's not a good idea to try and bluff if there's a lot of face cards, or if the board connects with their tight range. You want to try and keep the pot small against them, unless you've got a solid and well-concealed hand. If you've got a solid hand, try and use their betting tendencies against them. Typically, tight players are going to raise almost as many hands as they play, so you can assume that there's a relatively small gap between what they raise with and what they call with. You do want to keep in mind, however, that these ranges will change according to just how aggressive or passive the player is. There's definitely no shortage of loose aggressive players online, mostly due to the fact that the majority of players are just casual players, looking for some fun and excitement. A loose aggressive playing style offers plenty of action and gives a player the chance to splash chips around. A loose aggressive player will usually raise before and after the flop, and they'll definitely be playing a pretty wide range of hands. They typically play far more hands than they should be, and they compensate for this by showing a lot of aggression and putting pressure on their opponents to fold what will often be a winning hand. It's because of their loose aggression that it can often be hard to put them on an accurate hand range, but it's safe to assume that a lot of the time they will be bluffing with absolutely nothing. Loose aggressive players rely primarily on aggression to win pots. Their style, if played correctly, can actually be beneficial, as not only does it allow them to win a lot of small pots with bluffs, but they also tend to get paid off on their bigger hands because people will tend to call them down later, thinking they're just trying to buy yet another pot with nothing. The best way to play against a player that's loose and aggressive is to tighten up your range and wait for a good hand. It pays to be patient against them, as when you finally do get a hand, you can use their aggression against them and get paid off on your big hands. Pre-flop, it's best to re-raise them to build a pot while you're ahead of them. Don't be afraid to get a lot of money in the pot against them pre-flop, because you're often going to be miles ahead of what they're raising with. If you hit a good flop, you want to bet and raise to protect against potential draws, but you also have to have the discipline to let go of a hand if things don't go right on later streaks. Now, the only real problem with a loose aggressive player is that they're probably going to be losing their stack pretty quickly. Good players love to play against this type of player, as they know a big pot could be coming their way pretty quick. While it's true that there are a lot of good loose aggressive players, most loose aggressive players are weak players who don't know how to control their aggression and just end up trying to bluff in all the wrong spots. The key to beating a loose aggressive player is just to have a lot of patience and use their aggression against them. A good portion of online poker players are going to fall into the loose passive category. These are the type of players that are commonly referred to as fish or calling stations or donkeys. They're the weakest players, and therefore they're the easiest to read and exploit. A loose passive player is going to play far too many hands and will almost always continue to call a bet when they should either be folding or raising. Typically, the only time they're going to show aggression is when they have a big hand, which makes it easy to know when to fold against them. Typically, loose passive players usually have no concept of pot odds and are just going to keep calling bets to chase draws even when they're getting poor odds to call. The only time a loose passive player will ever show aggression is when they have a good hand, so because of this, loose passive players are pretty easy to read and adjust to. One of the most important things to remember when playing against a loose passive player is to try not to bluff them. They're going to call your bets with pretty much anything, so it's just not profitable to try and bluff them. The key to adjusting to these type of players is just to exercise pot control. Make them pay for draws and value bet them when you think you're ahead. If a draw connects and they suddenly become aggressive, it's definitely time to give up the hand. You want to try and keep the pot small against them when you're weak and build them when you know you're ahead. Now, these aren't the kind of players that you want to be slow playing, as they're only going to show aggression when they're strong. Because of this, you don't want to be checking in hopes that they're betting, since if they're on a draw or weak, they're going to just check behind anyways, and you don't want to be giving them a free card. For loose players, you can expect them to be raising a pretty wide range of hands and calling with an even wider range. Typically, you can expect them to be raising with this kind of range and what they call with. You do want to keep in mind, however, that these ranges will change according to just how aggressive or passive the player is. And if you're up against an ultra maniac, you can pretty much expect them to be playing any two cards that they get dealt. Again, you do want to keep in mind that these ranges will change depending on the aggressive tendencies of the player. There will be a gap between what they're going to call with and what they're going to raise with, depending on how passive or aggressive they are. By categorizing your opponent and using the proper strategy against them, you will do well against anyone that you meet at the tables. While there certainly are a wide variety of players online, they all typically employ a strategy that falls within one of the four styles that we've discussed. The best strategy that you can employ is just to pay attention to the tendencies of your opponents and react accordingly. As usual, thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to click like and subscribe to the channel to be notified of uploads. Also check out legdonkey.com, link below, for more poker news and strategy articles.